Hi, I'm Rachel Bomberger with Erdman's Publishing, and I'm here today with Roger Olson and Christian Collins Winn. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Let's start by you telling me just a little bit about yourselves.
Okay. Well, I'm Roger Olson, and I teach at Baylor University at Truett Seminary, which is part of Baylor University. And I used to teach at Bethel College, where Christian teaches. In fact, he kind of took my position there after I left. There was someone between us, I think. But anyway, and I live in Texas.
And Christian?
Yes, my name is Christian Collins Winn, and I teach historical theology at Bethel University. I'm originally from North Carolina, but I live in Minnesota now, so I've gotten used to the weather, I think, after 10 years.
All right. Can you tell me a little bit about this new book?
Yeah, I think, so the book is called Reclaiming Pietism, Retrieving an Evangelical Tradition, and I guess it was about 3 years ago, and actually prior to that, maybe it was 2009, Bethel hosted a conference on pietism, because Bethel comes from a tradition of Swedish pietism, Swedish Baptist pietism, and I was involved in helping to organize that conference with my colleagues, Chris Gerritz and G.W. Carlson, and we were beginning a kind of revival of interest in pietism at Bethel. And Roger, I'm not sure, Roger, you were at the conference?
Mm-hmm.
You presented?
I gave a plenary lecture.
Yeah, that's right. And so we sort of started to, I guess at that point, kind of shared interest in pietism, and then Roger's the one that came up with the idea of actually writing this book. So
I've had an interest in pietism for a lot of years, and primarily because I grew up pietist in a church, in a home where pietism was a good and positive term and concept. And then when I got into seminary, I began to hear it used in a negative way. And then throughout my adult life, I've heard it used negatively many times by many people, in fact, rarely positively. Mm-hmm. And so for a long time, I've wanted to sort of reinvest the term pietism with its original positive meaning and retrieve the term as something good, and also kind of breathe new life into the movement, or at least the ethos of pietism, which is heartfelt Christianity.
So why do you think that pietism has come to be such a negative concept, both in popular, ideology and also in the scholarly world?
Well, the negative connotation of it probably goes back further, but a German theologian named Albrecht Ritzel, who was one of the real leaders of the liberal Protestant movement in the late 19th century, wrote a 3-volume history of pietism. And he was very negative toward pietism, and so he didn't help its reputation any at all. But I don't know where the popular negativity of the term comes from. I doubt it's from Ritzel, but just over the years it's kind of developed, like many good terms, get used in a negative way. So I don't know how that actually happened, but now people tend to think of pietistic as holier than thou, or legalistic Christianity, or anti-intellectual, and none of that was true of the original pietist movement of the early 1700s. Mm-hmm. So we want to go back and talk about how the movement began, what its ethos was, and show that it's still alive in a very positive way today, even where people don't recognize it as pietism.
Yeah. I think you say something that in the book about how bad pietism over the years has sort of ruined its reputation, and yet good pietism is something that we don't want to lose.
Right.
What would you say is the nature of good pietism? What are you trying to reclaim?
Well, I tend to think of pietism in terms of the good as a kind of complex of what I would call transformational Christianity, right? So this sense that the early Christian documents, right, the New Testament, are all operating with this assumption that Jesus lives, and that there's been some sort of encounter, and that encounter between the community and the person does not leave the person unchanged. Right, they're transformed, they're changed, and there's this relationship that's developing, and so pietism begins effectively as a kind of renewal movement, basically, and probably one of the reasons why it kind of falls into disfavor is it begins as a renewal movement. It begins outside of the established institutions. over time, its argument, its way of conceiving the Christian faith gets traction, and it comes to power. And when it comes to power, perhaps that's when sort of the bad forms of pietism, right, it becomes institutionalized effectively. So the transformational piece begins, though, with this kind of interaction with the living Christ, and the pietist is very interested in the fact that they've experienced this thing called the new birth, and this new birth means that they've been changed. And the way that I see sort of this becoming a complex is they ask themselves, if I can be different, why can't the church be different? And if the church can be different, why can't the world be different? And so the pietist ethos is effectively attempting to work out faithfully what that would mean in different kinds of settings, whether they're ecclesial or social.
Now, would you two both consider yourselves pietists? And is that something that is a lifelong thing or a recent thing? How, if you are pietists, how did you come to it?
Yeah, I don't have any qualms about calling myself a pietist, although I hope when I do that, people will sit and listen for a few minutes so I can explain what I mean, because it often means something different to me than it does to them. So the book is partly to be able to say to people, well, if you're interested, read my book, or at least give them kind of a nutshell description of good pietism. But I do call myself a pietist without any hesitation. And where I used to teach, where Christian teaches now, comes out of the pietist tradition and is sort of retrieving its pietist heritage and background in a good way. And that began to happen while I was still teaching there. And the seminary where I teach now, though we don't necessarily use the word pietist, we are pietistic in that we require all of our students to participate in weekly covenant groups. Mm-hmm. And so there's a strong emphasis on spiritual formation. And I would call that in and of itself pietistic.
I think so. And what about you, Christian?
Yeah, I guess I would consider myself a pietist of a certain kind. I would have the same kind of, I guess, I don't know if it's qualms or concerns. It's sort of like labels in general. You want to make sure that people understand what it is that you're using this term, what it means, and what it means to them, and what it means to you. And so, but I've been deeply shaped, particularly by a certain kind of pietism, notably coming out of the Württemberg tradition and the Blumhardts, who are very significant figures for me. And they are sort of oriented around a living eschatology, kind of a hope, a kind of hope-filled orientation, and so yeah, I would consider myself a pietist of that type.
Now, who do you hope will read the book, and what do you hope they take away from it?
Well, we hope everyone reads it, of course.
Of course.
We want it to be a bestseller.
But the audience, the first audience, is fellow evangelicals who may not be aware of the influence of pietism on evangelicalism. So the evangelical movement in America was deeply influenced by pietism, and many people aren't aware of that. We want to make them more aware of that, and also recommend pietism to them as a path toward the renewal of evangelicalism. But the book is really written for anyone who's interested in Christian history, historical theology, and especially, I think, for Americans, pietism is a huge influence on American religion in general. I think all denominations in America have been touched by pietism, whether they're aware of it or not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just in some ways echo Roger. I think one of the reasons I was drawn to pietism in part through graduate exposure. I also grew up Methodist, which has a deep pietist strain in it, and but Don Dayton sort of put me onto these figures called the Blumhardts, the ones that I mentioned earlier. And initially, I bore the kind of pietism that sounds not much fun. I don't really want to embrace that necessarily. But over time, both in terms of its spirituality, its understanding of the gospel, and particularly, I think what Roger was kind of getting at, the sense that if you want to understand certain dynamics in modern Christianity and you don't know what pietism is, you don't know about the categories and the dynamics of pietism, you're not going to be able to fully understand those things. And so in a way, like, we're trying to offer a kind of hermeneutical key, an additional tool for scholars and lay people who are trying to understand their own history, their own tradition.
So what else would you like readers to know about the book?
Well, I'd like them to know that it's an interesting book. It has stories in it. It's not just dry history or theology, though I don't find either history or theology ever dry. But some people might. But we've invested stories in this book, and people reading it will read about key figures in their lives and their spiritual journeys and what happened with them as part of Pietism. Mm-hmm. So I think it's an intriguing book and even exciting.
You crammed a lot into not a lot of pages.
Right.
So it's not
we kept it short on purpose.
Not a big, scary book to read.
No, it's not.
No. Christian?
Yeah, I guess I would echo, again, what Roger was saying, in that I think the book offers an alternative way of thinking about evangelical history. And that doesn't mean that it's dry history or dry theology, because we are trying to kind of weave and make that point through these stories. But it really is, I think we're trying to surface maybe a genetic part of people's identity that they don't always know, or they don't have the categories by which to express that. And I think because of that, the book has the potential to be very useful in churches, and certainly, for individuals in classrooms and things like that, you would have that. But whenever you're trying to help people, not just do intellectual work, but actually think about who they are and how they understand themselves and why they fit or don't fit in certain kinds of contexts, it feels like you're doing holy work, so there's something about this book.
Yeah, for us, writing this book was a ministry. It wasn't just a scholarly project. We really wanted to use this book and this opportunity to write and publish it to contribute to a spiritual renewing of American Christianity by pointing out our resources in Pietism and how that is a rich spiritual heritage that if we recover it, it really can, I think, bring spiritual renewal to American Christian life.
Historical theology as a ministry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like that. Well, thank you both for talking with us about the book. The book, again, is Reclaiming Pietism, and it's from Urbans.